Hello, psychology students, and welcome to my first video lecture. So, um, in this lecture, we'll be going over Module 2 in Chapter 1, called Research Methods and Ethics. And feel free to watch this video as many times as you need to. Feel free to pause, go back, replay, as many times as you need to until you remember important vocabulary and understand important ideas. If you have any questions, you can always email me if you need more explanation. So let's get started. We'll be looking at Lesson Objective 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. The scientific method is very important to psychology because psychology is a science and it allows us to reduce bias or mistakes or falsehoods in our data. So when you hear reports of a psychological study, research study, you know that it's going to be more fact and with minimal amounts of bias in it. So, as far as psychology is concerned, the scientific method involves formulating a question, developing a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, drawing conclusions, and then reporting your results. Let's go back. So, I may formulate a question: does eating cheeseburgers make you more happy? That's a tentative question that I want to have answered. I can develop a hypothesis, a tentative explanation. So, the meat and cheese in a hamburger or a cheeseburger makes a person happier. Now I need to develop a research study to test that hypothesis to see if my possible explanation is true. Once I perform that research study, I can draw conclusions of whether my hypothesis was true or not. If it's true, I can now use that towards a theory that meat and cheese makes people happier. I need to report my results, so I need to not just keep this information to myself, but I need to write a report and publish it and put it out there for two reasons. A, I need to tell everyone exactly how I did my research study so that other people can replicate it or repeat the study. If other people can do exactly what I did in my study, then and get the same results, then that means my conclusions are reliable or trustworthy. And that makes my research study and my conclusion, my hypothesis, stronger. Now, there are many different types of research studies you could use to test your hypothesis. One is a naturalistic observation, which is very simply put, you go out into the environment and you watch animals or humans behave in their normal environment. So, for example, Jane Goodall is very famous for this. She goes out into Africa, she observes chimpanzees, and we know a lot more information about chimpanzee behavior because of her naturalistic observations. The advantage of this is that we get a realistic picture of human or animal behavior. So we get to see real-world behavior. We get to see exactly what they're doing as they're doing it in the real world. So the information that comes from a naturalistic observation, it's 100% true because it really happened. Now, there's a few disadvantages to this type of research study, is the fact that observer effect. So everyone knows that when you're being watched, you act differently. So when the principal comes into the room, you act better than you normally would in class. So if you're going to do a naturalist observation, make sure the people you're watching don't know they're being watched so that they will act as realistic and normal as possible. Now, also, the observer themselves can have bias. So even if the people don't know they're being watched, I could unintentionally interpret their behavior as proving my hypothesis. Each naturalistic setting is unique. This is true of anything. So if I go into an In-N-Out burger and I want to see how happy people are eating their cheeseburgers, if I do it on Saturday night, of course they're going to be happier because it's Saturday night. If I go in on a Monday at lunch, people are going to be less happy because it's Monday and it's lunch. So It does have flaws, but it can be a useful type of study. Laboratory observations try to reduce the bias and all the possible different causes of behavior by controlling the environment. So that's one advantage. The disadvantage is it's an artificial situation. So you're likely to get artificial behavior that you're not going to see in the real world. So that's one problem that you can't generalize this, we like to say. We can't generalize what we see in the laboratory to the real world, that they're only going to do it in the laboratory. And that's a big problem that you have to consider if you do a laboratory observation. There's also case studies. So you look at one person or one group and you draw conclusions about everyone based on that one person or one group. Now that has some obvious advantages. So you're getting realistic behavior from one person or a group, from a real group. But the problem is these people can be extreme. So these people are not necessarily normal. So if I study, let's say, a genius, or if I study the KKK or another hate group, their behavior is not going to be generalized to the normal population. I can't say what the KKK do is what everyone does. So those are some disadvantages. And Phineas Gage we'll talk about in Chapter 2. Also, we can do surveys. So, for example, I did a survey on the very first day. I asked you a series of questions about a particular topic. So, what kind of grade do you want to get in this class? What kind of student are you? What are your goals? What do I need to know about you? Stuff like that. So, what's important about a survey is the idea of a representative sample. Obviously, I can't test all people. I can't give all the people in the world who eat cheeseburgers a survey. So I have to pick a smaller sample. So a sample is a smaller group inside that population. So let's say I want to test high school students. If a high school student eats a cheeseburger, do they become happier? Let's say I want to test that. So my population is high school students, and all of them. All in the country or all in the world, doesn't matter. Now, obviously, I can't test all the high school students in the world. But what I can do is I can take a group of them, a sample, but I have to make sure that they're representative. And I have to randomly select high school students to participate in my sample so that I'm not introducing bias into my study. Now, the advantage of this is that I can get data from a large number of people. Very, very large. So I can get thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people take a survey. And I can also study covert behavior. So I can ask people about things that they would not do in public. So I can ask them about private behavior. Disadvantages. I have to ensure that my sample is representative. If it's not representative, then I have problems. Like I said with the KKK. The KKK is not representative of all people. So anything that is true of them is certainly not going to be true of all people. Same thing with Royal Pacific Academy. If I want to say Royal Pacific Academy students are happier when they eat cheeseburgers, then I have to have a sample of students. Now, I can't survey all the students, but I can survey a small group of Royal Pacific Academy students. But to make them representative, I would have to have 80% of my sample be Chinese or international students, and 20% be American, in order to be representative and in order for me to generalize that information to the larger population. Now, people are not always accurate. So sometimes people take a survey and they either unintentionally or intentionally lie. They give desirable answers. So if I say, how many hours do you spend doing homework? Maybe they really do 2, but they don't want to admit that, so they say they do 8 hours to make themselves look good. Other times, people don't actually know how many hours they actually spend studying. So they guess, and their guess might be wrong. So those are possible ways that bias can get into a survey. Again, you're beginning to see that no research study is perfect, but there are advantages and disadvantages to every method. Now, everything we've said before is descriptive. So all these methods before can describe the behavior, but they're not necessarily very good at explaining or predicting the behavior or even controlling the behavior. So a correlational method is better at explaining the behavior. So a correlation is a measure of the relationship between two variables. And the variables are anything that can change or vary. So for example, the amount of time students study, that can change. Sometimes they spend a lot of time studying, and sometimes you don't spend any time studying. And also your grades. Sometimes you get good grades, sometimes you get bad grades. But we can say that there's a relationship between how much time you spend studying and what your grades are. Obviously, the more you study, the higher the grade. That's a correlation. Now, I can take those two variables, I can collect how many hours you spend studying, I can collect your grades, I can put them into mathematical formula, and I'll get a correlation coefficient, which is represented by R. And it tells me two things: the direction of the relationship. So, for example, does having good grades cause the amount of time you study? Or does the amount of time you study cause your grades? And that's a very hard conclusion to make. And either of them is true. And I can't, with a correlation, I can't say with any certainty which direction is true. Now, the strength of the relationship. A correlation coefficient also tells me how strong or weak the relationship is. So if I get a correlation coefficient 0.1, that means it's very weak. But if I get, say, 0.8, then the highest is 1.0, 100%. If it's 0.8, then that's a very strong relationship. So again, I can't tell you what causes good grades or what causes times to study. All I know is that they're very strongly related, and I should recommend that students spend a lot of time studying. So one big problem with correlations is that they do not prove causation. I could tell you to study more, but it might be true that people who get good grades spend more time. So again, you cannot identify the cause or effect in a relationship. You can only identify the relationship between two variables. That's it. The experimental method. So this is one of the best research methods we have out there, and I recommend you use it. And in this particular method, I will go over this in a separate video. So look for this as the second video in this assignment. Thanks very much.